Hello, guys. Today we are going to discuss one of the most haunting and misunderstood stories ever whispered out of the ancient world, the story of the Anunnaki, the gods who shaped humanity, governed the earth, and quietly decided how much suffering the human race would be allowed to endure. This is not a story of monsters in the sky or science fiction invaders, but a slow, deep, unsettling history of how ancient people understood fate, power, and the terrifying silence of the divine. Long before there were kings, long before there were nations, and long before the first human ever wrote a word, the people of Mesopotamia looked up at the sky and saw not randomness but will. They believed the universe was ruled by beings older than memory, beings who did not shout, did not argue, and did not explain themselves. These beings were called the Anunnaki. Their names were spoken softly, not out of love, but out of awareness. Because when the Anunnaki decided something, it was not a suggestion, it was reality. The rivers flowed because they allowed it, crops grew because they permitted it. Children were born and people died not by chance, but because the Anunnaki had weighed those lives on invisible scales and made a quiet decision. There was no appeal. No prayer could undo what had already been written in their divine tablets. To understand how the Anunnaki punished humanity, we first need to understand something far more disturbing. They did not think like humans. They did not feel anger the way we do. They did not seek revenge. They did not enjoy cruelty. In fact, most of the time, they did not even notice individual human beings at all. To them, humanity was not a collection of people. It was a force, a presence, a noise in the world, and when that noise grew too loud, the gods acted. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are described as the children of Anu, the sky god, but they were not just celestial beings floating in clouds. They were administrators of reality. Each one controlled a domain: water, fertility, death, law, storms, fate. Together, they formed something like a cosmic council. They met, they debated, they voted, and their decisions shaped the entire human world. Humans, according to these ancient stories, were not created out of love. They were created out of necessity. In the beginning, the younger gods were forced to do the labor of the universe. They dug canals, they cleared land, they maintained the systems that kept the world running, and they hated it. They rebelled, they laid down their tools, they surrounded the great gods and demanded relief. And so the Anunnaki made a choice that would echo for thousands of years. They decided to create humanity. Using clay and the blood of a slain god, they shaped a new being, something that could work, could suffer, could obey, and could die. Humans would carry the burden that the gods no longer wished to bear. We were not created to be cherished, we were created to be useful. At first, this arrangement worked. Humans farmed, humans built, humans served the gods by maintaining the temples, the offerings, and the rituals that kept the divine order stable. In return, the Anunnaki protected them. Crops grew. Floods were held back, disease was kept at bay. The world was harsh, but it was predictable. But humanity did something unexpected. They multiplied, villages became cities, cities became civilizations, and with each new generation the human presence on Earth grew louder, not just in sound but in energy. Fires burned, drums beat, people sang, cried, prayed, argued, and fought. To the gods this was not beautiful, it was disturbing. In the Epic of Atrahasis, one of the oldest human stories ever recorded, the Anunnaki complain that humans have become too noisy. They cannot sleep, they cannot rest. The endless activity of humanity is described as a kind of cosmic irritation, like an insect buzzing in a quiet room. And so the gods decide to act, not with rage, not with hatred, but with cold administrative precision. They send drought. The rains stop falling, crops wither, rivers shrink, people grow hungry. Not because they have sinned, but because there are too many of them. The Anunnaki are not punishing disobedience. They are correcting imbalance, but humans survive. They pray, they adapt, they endure. So the gods escalate. They send disease, plagues sweep through the cities. Children die, families collapse, entire neighborhoods vanish. But even then, humanity clings to life. The population drops, but not enough. The noise continues. And so the Anunnaki make their most devastating decision. They will wipe the slate clean, the Great Flood. In Mesopotamian mythology, this is not a moral story. It is not about sin, it is about numbers. Humanity has grown too large, too difficult to manage, too disruptive to divine peace. One man, Atrahasis, is warned by a god who sympathizes with humans. He builds a boat. He saves his family and some animals. Everyone else drowns. When the waters recede, the earth is silent. For the first time in centuries, the gods can rest. But something unexpected happens. The Anunnaki regret what they have done. They had not intended to nearly destroy their own creation. They wanted control, not extinction. And so after the flood, they do something far more profound than any storm. They change what it means to be human. Instead of sending punishment from the outside, they place it inside us. They shorten human lifespans so populations cannot explode again. They introduce childbirth pain so reproduction is not effortless. They allow disease to exist permanently. They make aging inevitable. They ensure that no matter how advanced civilization becomes, suffering will always be built into the human experience. This is the Anunnaki's true legacy. Not wrath, not torture, but limitation. From that moment on, humans no longer needed to anger the gods to suffer. They were born into a world where suffering was automatic. Hunger, illness, loss, death, all became normal. Not because humanity failed, but because the gods decided that this was the only way to keep the world quiet. And so humanity learned to live in a universe where pain was not punishment, it was structure. In the generations that followed, people still prayed. They still feared the gods, they still brought offerings, but something had changed. The divine presence felt more distant, more quiet. The Anunnaki were no longer walking among humans, shaping every moment. They had retreated into the background, leaving behind a world that would regulate itself through natural limits. This is where the true mystery begins, because when the gods stepped back, humans were left alone with their own fragility. They would build empires, they would write laws, they would create myths, they would wage wars, but no matter how powerful they became, they could never escape what had been woven into their biology by the ancient gods. And deep beneath every civilization, every religion, every story about heaven and hell, there remained a quiet echo of this ancient truth. Human suffering was not an accident, it was a design. The silence that followed the Great Flood was not peaceful, it was hollow. The rivers returned to their banks, the mud dried and cracked beneath the sun, and small pockets of humanity began to crawl back into existence like fragile sparks in a world that had almost gone dark forever. Villages were rebuilt from driftwood and broken stone. Families reformed out of grief and memory. And above it all, the Anunnaki watched, no longer angry but no longer trusting either. The gods had learned something from the flood. They had learned that humanity was resilient. Too resilient. Even when crushed, scattered, and drowned beneath the weight of the heavens, humans found ways to return. And so the Anunnaki shifted their strategy. They no longer sought to erase humanity. They sought to govern it more subtly, more permanently, more invisibly. Where once they used storms and plagues, now they used fate. In Mesopotamian belief, fate was not a metaphor. It was a real thing written down on divine tablets called the Tablets of Destiny. These were not symbols. They were literal records of what would happen, who would be born, who would die, who would rise to power, who would fall. The Anunnaki were the keepers of these tablets. They did not guess the future, they assigned it. Every human life in their view was a line in a ledger. Most people would never know their fate had been decided. They would simply experience it as luck, misfortune, coincidence, or tragedy. But behind every unexpected death, every sudden illness, every rise and fall of a king, there was an Anunnaki judgment written quietly into the fabric of reality. This was the new punishment: no more thunder from the sky, no more divine armies, just invisible limits placed on every life. The worst part was that no one could escape it. In the old days, a human could anger a god and know it. They could make an offering, perform a ritual, or beg for mercy. But under the system of fate, there was nothing to negotiate. You did not know what had been written for you. You could not change it. You could only walk toward it. To the Anunnaki, this was mercy. To humans, it was terror disguised as normality. The ancient priests understood this. They were not just spiritual lighters. They were translators of divine will. They watched the skies, they read the entrails of animals, they interpreted dreams. All of it was an attempt to glimpse the decisions of the Anunnaki before they fully unfolded. Because if you could see fate coming, maybe, just maybe, you could soften its blow. But most of the time you could not. The Anunnaki did not punish mistakes in the way later religions would imagine. There was no concept of eternal damnation. There was no hellfire waiting for sinners. Instead, there was something colder: misalignment. If a human's life fell out of alignment with divine order, that life would slowly unravel. A farmer's crops would fail year after year. A king's reign would collapse into rebellion. A family would lose children one by one, not because of moral failure, but because their thread in the cosmic tapestry had been pulled too tight or too loose or not at all. In this way, suffering became a kind of quiet correction, and this is why the Anunnaki were so feared. Not because they were cruel, but because they were indifferent. In Sumerian hymns, the gods are described as radiant and powerful, but also distant and unmoved by human tears. A man could weep in the temple for days and the god might never respond, not because the god was evil, but because to a being who measured existence in centuries and eons, one human life was like a flicker of dust. And so humans learned to live carefully. They learned to follow rituals not out of devotion, but out of survival. They learned to obey not out of love, but out of fear of falling out of favor with forces they could not see. The Anunnaki had succeeded. Humanity was manageable again, but something else began to happen in the long centuries after the flood. As gods withdrew from daily life, humans began to fill the silence with stories. They told tales of heroes, monsters, and divine battles. They reimagined the Anunnaki not as cosmic administrators, but as personal beings, gods who cared, who loved, who punished, who rewarded. This was comforting, but it was also a misunderstanding. The Anunnaki never stopped ruling, they simply stopped explaining. As empires rose, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, the gods became more symbolic. Their names were carved into stone. Their images were painted on temple walls, but their presence became quieter, less immediate. More like gravity than thunder, yet the machinery of fate kept turning. Every great empire eventually collapsed. Every powerful dynasty fell. Every golden age faded. And beneath all of it, the old Mesopotamian truth remained: no human structure lasts unless the Anunnaki allow it. Even kings understood this. They did not rule because of bloodlines alone. They ruled because the gods had chosen them. When a king failed, it was not because he was weak, it was because the Anunnaki had withdrawn their support. This made leadership terrifying. A king could do everything right and still lose everything, and in that fear we see the true shadow of the Anunnaki's punishment system. It was not based on morality, it was based on cosmic balance. Humans were pieces on a board, and sometimes pieces must be removed so the game can continue. Over time, this worldview evolved. As Mesopotamian civilization passed into Assyria, Babylon, and later cultures, the Anunnaki slowly transformed in human imagination. They became angels, they became demons, they became watchers, they became fallen beings who once ruled the world and then disappeared, but their core function remained. They were still the ones who set limits, and those limits still define human life today. Aging, illness, accidents, natural disasters, the slow erosion of everything we build. These are not punishments for mistakes, they are the structure of the world the Anunnaki left behind. Long after the floodwaters faded into memory and the great cities of stone rose again along the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity entered a new and unsettling phase of its relationship with the Anunnaki. The gods were no longer destroying the world, but they were not embracing it either. Instead, they were selecting it, choosing some, ignoring others. And in that quiet act of divine preference, a new kind of suffering was born. To the ancient Mesopotamians, not all humans were equal in the eyes of the gods. Some were born under lucky stars, some were blessed with strong bodies, some rose to power against impossible odds, and some were doomed from the moment they took their first breath. This was not seen as unfair, it was seen as divine order. The Anunnaki did not punish every mistake, but they did decide whose lives would matter. This belief shaped everything. Bloodlines became sacred. Kings claimed divine ancestry. Certain families believed they were chosen by the gods to rule, to lead, to be remembered. Meanwhile, others lived entire lives in obscurity, convinced that no matter how hard they worked, their fate had already been sealed. In this way, the Anunnaki's punishment system became invisible but absolute. If you were born into misfortune, it was not because you had sinned. It was because you had not been selected. Ancient astrologers studied the sky obsessively, believing that the Anunnaki spoke through the movements of stars and planets. A child born under one constellation might live long. Another born under a different one might die young. This was not superstition. This was fate reading, the attempt to glimpse the gods' quiet choices. Every eclipse, every comet, every strange alignment, all were seen as messages from the Anunnaki about who would rise and who would fall. And sometimes those messages were terrifying. There are tablets describing years when omens foretold disaster for entire cities. Priests would warn kings that the gods were displeased. Sometimes a temporary substitute king would be placed on the throne because if the gods intended to strike the ruler, better that the wrong man die. This was not symbolic. They truly believed the Anunnaki would target someone. The idea that divine punishment could be misdirected says everything about how deeply fate controlled their thinking. They believed suffering was unavoidable. All they could do was try to shift who it would land on. And behind it all stood the Anunnaki, silent and unmoved. But something even darker lurked beneath this system. Because if the gods could choose who would prosper, they could also choose who would be sacrificed. In the oldest stories, some humans were created not to live long lives, but to serve specific cosmic purposes. Warriors destined to die in battle. Priests destined to carry knowledge that would drive them mad. Kings destined to fall so that new dynasties could rise. These people were not cursed, they were used. And this is perhaps the most chilling idea in Anunnaki mythology, that suffering was not random, it was assigned. Even tragedy had a role. A famine was not just hunger, it was population control. A war was not just conflict, it was rebalancing. A plague was not just disease, it was cleansing. The Anunnaki did not see these as evils, they saw them as maintenance. To humans, this was unbearable. So humanity did what it always does when faced with an indifferent universe. It created stories to make the pain feel personal. Over time, the Anunnaki became more human in myth. They argued, they fell in love, they became jealous, they punished sins, they rewarded virtue. These stories were comforting because they suggested that suffering had meaning. But the oldest texts tell a colder truth. The gods did not care if you were good, they cared if you were necessary. And that idea shaped the entire foundation of civilization. Why do some people rise from nothing? Why do others fall despite their efforts? Why do disasters strike some regions and not others? To the ancient Mesopotamians, the answer was always the same. The Anunnaki decided. This belief created both devotion and dread. Temples were built not just to worship, but to stay visible, to remind the gods that humans were still useful, still obedient, still worth keeping. Because the greatest fear was not punishment, it was being forgotten. To be ignored by the gods meant to drift into chaos. Crops would fail, cities would crumble, enemies would invade. A life without divine attention was a life without protection. And yet, as centuries passed, the Anunnaki grew quieter. New gods rose, old names faded, empires replaced each other. But beneath every new religion, every new myth, the old system still pulsed. Fate, limits, mortality. These were the fingerprints of the Anunnaki. Even when people stopped calling them by name, they still lived inside the rules of the world the gods had designed. As the ancient world moved forward, something strange and powerful happened to the memory of the Anunnaki. Their names slowly faded from everyday speech, but their shadow did not. It stretched forward through centuries, through empires, through new religions that rose upon the bones of old ones. The gods of Mesopotamia were not erased, they were transformed. And with that transformation came something far more frightening than anything the Anunnaki had ever done: the idea of moral punishment. In the old Sumerian worldview, suffering was not about right and wrong, it was about balance. The gods did not punish thieves for stealing or liars for lying. They adjusted the world when it became too loud, too crowded, too unstable. But as human societies became more complex, people began to crave something different. They wanted their pain to mean something. They wanted to believe that if they behaved correctly, they would be safe. And so the memory of the Anunnaki began to shift. The old gods of fate and balance were slowly reshaped into judges of behavior. Their quiet, administrative control of the universe turned into a moral system. Instead of simply assigning suffering where it was needed, the gods were now imagined to reward goodness and punish evil. This was comforting. It made the world feel fair. But it also planted the seed of something far darker than anything the Anunnaki had ever imposed. Because once suffering becomes moral, it becomes eternal. The Mesopotamian underworld had once been a dull, gray place, a shadowy realm where all humans went, regardless of how they lived. There was no torture, no fire, no judgment, just a quiet, dusty existence after death. But as older beliefs merged with newer ones, that changed. The idea of divine accountability began to grow. Gods no longer simply governed life, they evaluated it. And the quiet fate written on divine tablets began to look more like a verdict. By the time later cultures inherited these ideas, the Anunnaki had been reborn as something else entirely. They became angels, they became demons, they became watchers and fallen beings. Their roles as cosmic administrators turned into roles as spiritual enforcers. The machinery of fate became a court of judgment. And now punishment was no longer just about the survival of the world, it was about the soul. This was a terrifying evolution. In the old Anunnaki system, suffering ended with death. You were born, you lived, you struggled, you died, and that was it. The gods were done with you. But in the new religious imagination, death was only the beginning. If you failed, you could suffer forever. This idea did not come from nowhere. It grew out of the ancient fear that the gods were always watching, always recording, always deciding. The tablets of destiny became books of judgment, fate became sin, and suddenly every mistake mattered, every thought, every action, every desire. The Anunnaki had never cared about any of that. They had cared about noise, balance, and order. But now humanity had taken their old gods and turned them into eternal judges, and in doing so they created hell. What had once been a system of cosmic management became a system of infinite punishment. And it began with the same ancient fear: what happens when the gods are displeased? In this new worldview, gods were no longer distant forces. They were moral beings. They could be angered, they could be offended, they could be disappointed, and when they were, the punishment was no longer famine or flood, it was damnation. This was humanity's way of filling the silence left by the Anunnaki. When the old gods stopped speaking, people imagined new ones who spoke louder, judged harder, and punished longer. But beneath all of it, the ancient logic still remained. Human beings were limited, they were fragile, they were mortal, they were imperfect. Those limits had not disappeared, they had simply been given a new story. And now, instead of saying the gods made us this way, people said we failed. The Anunnaki's biological governors, disease, death, aging, became moral flaws. To suffer was no longer to exist, to suffer was to deserve it. This was a profound shift, and it created an entirely new kind of fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of being watched, fear that one wrong move could condemn you not just in life but forever. The Anunnaki had never demanded perfection. They had demanded order, but now humanity demanded perfection from itself and punished itself when it failed. This is how the quiet, administrative gods of Mesopotamia became the roots of the most terrifying idea in human history: that suffering is not just part of the world, it is your fault. As the memory of the Anunnaki faded into new names and new religions, something remarkable and unsettling took hold of the human mind. The gods were no longer simply forces of nature or distant keepers of fate. They had become watchers, and when gods become watchers, fear becomes internal. In the ancient Mesopotamian world, people feared the gods because they controlled floods, droughts, and disease. But in the new spiritual systems that grew from those ancient roots, people began to fear something much closer. They began to fear themselves. If the gods could see everything, then every thought could be judged. If fate could be written, then every desire could be weighed. And slowly, quietly, humanity learned to monitor its own behavior, to suppress its own impulses, and to punish itself for imagined failures. This was the final transformation of the Anunnaki's legacy. From cosmic administrators to moral overseers to invisible eyes inside the human mind. The ancient idea that gods recorded destiny turned into the belief that gods recorded sin. And now the punishment was no longer simply misfortune, it was guilt. Guilt is far more powerful than any flood. You cannot outrun it, you cannot hide from it, you cannot drown it. It lives inside you. This is how divine punishment became psychological. Human beings no longer needed gods to strike them. They would strike themselves. Every desire that felt forbidden, every impulse that felt wrong, every failure to live up to impossible standards, all of it became evidence of cosmic disapproval. And this created a world where suffering was no longer just something that happened. It was something you deserved. The Anunnaki had never said this, but their system made it possible. By turning fate into judgment, humanity turned limitation into shame. The old Mesopotamian belief had been simple. Humans were made to be imperfect. That was their function. They worked, they died, and they made room for the next generation. But now imperfection was treated as a crime, and this changed everything. Entire civilizations were built on this fear. Kings claimed divine authority not just to rule, but to judge. Priests claimed divine insight not just to guide, but to condemn. Laws were framed not just as rules, but as reflections of cosmic order. To break a law was not just to disrupt society, it was to offend the universe. This is how the Anunnaki's ancient system of order turned into systems of control. People obeyed not because they were forced. They obeyed because they were afraid of invisible consequences. Even death was no longer an escape. In the old world, death was simply the end of a human's usefulness. The soul went to a dull, quiet underworld. The gods moved on, but now death became a doorway to judgment. Heaven and hell were born from the same fear that once made humans look to the sky and whisper the names of the Anunnaki. Are we still wanted? Are we still allowed to exist? This fear never left us. It only changed its costume. And even in the modern world, stripped of ancient temples and carved tablets, the echo of the Anunnaki's system still lingers. We still believe in destiny. We still believe some people are meant to succeed and others are meant to fail. We still believe suffering must have a reason. We still search for meaning in pain. This is the inheritance of the ancient gods. They taught us that we are limited, that we are temporary, that we are governed by forces larger than ourselves. And even when we stopped believing in them, we kept believing in that. The Anunnaki may no longer have temples, but their world still exists, a world where life is fragile, where nothing lasts, where everything must eventually be reduced. When the Anunnaki finally faded from human memory, they did not vanish from human experience. Their greatest creation was never the human body, it was the human condition. A world where life is short, where loss is inevitable, where nothing we build survives untouched. Even without gods, the system they designed continued to operate quietly and relentlessly. And this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling, because it means humanity inherited a universe that was never meant to be gentle. The ancient Mesopotamians believed the world was not built for human happiness. It was built for cosmic balance. Humans were tools within it. When tools wear out, they are replaced. When they malfunction, they are discarded. This is why mortality was not a tragedy to the Anunnaki. It was maintenance. But to humans, mortality is everything. We love knowing it will end. We fear knowing it will end. We build knowing it will end. Every relationship, every dream, every ambition is shaped by the knowledge that it will not last. And that knowledge came from the gods. The Anunnaki made humans mortal not as punishment, but as regulation. They made death unavoidable so that no generation could grow too large, too powerful, too permanent. In doing so, they made suffering universal. You do not need to fail to suffer. You only need to live. This is why the ancient world was obsessed with legacy. Kings built monuments, priests recorded names, families preserved bloodlines. All of it was an attempt to resist the most terrifying punishment the Anunnaki ever imposed. Oblivion. To be forgotten was worse than to die. Because in a world where gods wrote fate, memory was the only form of survival. This is why the oldest stories are not just about heroes. They are about being remembered. Gilgamesh did not fear death, he feared disappearing. He wanted his name to outlive his body. This is not a coincidence. It is the psychological fingerprint of the Anunnaki's world. They made humans temporary, so humans made stories. But there is something else hidden inside this ancient mythology, something more disturbing than floods, fate, or even death. The idea that suffering is necessary. In the Anunnaki worldview, a world without suffering would be unstable. Pain kept humanity in check, loss kept populations balanced, death kept the system running, and so suffering was not a flaw, it was a feature. This belief still haunts us. We say pain builds character. We say struggle creates strength. We say loss gives life meaning. These are not just human ideas. They are echoes of divine engineering. The Anunnaki built a world where nothing could grow without cost, and now even in a world without gods, we still believe that. But what if it was never true? What if suffering was not required, only assumed? What if the Anunnaki's system was simply the result of limited imagination? This is the quiet rebellion hidden in human history. Every attempt to reduce suffering, every attempt to extend life, every attempt to create peace. These are acts of defiance against a world designed to be harsh. In curing disease, we challenge the gods. In feeding the hungry, we challenge the gods. In preserving life, we challenge the gods, even if we no longer believe in them, because the structure they left behind still shapes our reality. And perhaps that is the deepest legacy of the Anunnaki. They did not just limit humanity, they taught humanity to accept its limits. But somewhere deep inside every person who dreams of a better world, there is a quiet refusal, a whisper that says, maybe it does not have to be this way. As humanity stepped further into the modern world, something remarkable began to happen. The ancient architecture of fate, the invisible structure left behind by the Anunnaki, started to crack, not loudly, not suddenly, but slowly in quiet places where human curiosity and defiance grew stronger than fear. For the first time in history, people began to question whether suffering was truly inevitable. In the ancient world, pain was accepted as divine order. In the medieval world, it became moral judgment. But in the modern world, something new emerged, the idea that suffering might be a problem to solve. This was revolutionary. To cure disease was once seen as interfering with the will of the gods. To prevent death was once considered unnatural. To challenge fate was once sacrilege. But slowly, through science, medicine, and human ingenuity, people began to do exactly that. And without realizing it, they were undoing the oldest system ever created. The Anunnaki had governed humanity through limits, short lives, fragile bodies, unpredictable nature. But humans began to weaken those limits. Vaccines extended life, technology softened hardship, medicine pushed back death. The world that had once been carefully balanced by suffering started to change. And this created a quiet tension between the ancient design of the universe and the new will of humanity. Because when suffering decreases, something else happens, control loosens. The Anunnaki's power had never come from direct rule, it had come from dependence. Humans depended on the gods for rain, health, and survival. When that dependence faded, so did divine authority. But the structure was still there. Even in a world with hospitals and satellites, people still believed in fate. They still spoke of being meant for something. They still felt that invisible forces guided their lives. This is the ghost of the Anunnaki. Their greatest creation was not pain. It was the idea that pain has a purpose. And that idea refuses to die. Every time someone says everything happens for a reason, they are repeating an ancient belief. Every time someone accepts tragedy as destiny, they are echoing the tablets of fate. And yet, something is shifting. For the first time, humans are beginning to write their own. We are no longer just reacting to disasters. We are predicting them. We are not just enduring disease. We are eradicating it. We are not just living short, brutal lives. We are extending them, improving them, and questioning the limits placed on us. This is not just progress. It is rebellion, not against gods, but against the system the gods left behind. The Anunnaki never imagined a humanity that could escape its own design. They never anticipated a species that could look at mortality and say, "Not yet." They never foresaw beings who would refuse to accept that suffering is necessary. And so, in a strange way, the modern world is the most dangerous thing the Anunnaki ever created, because it is a world where humans no longer quietly obey fate. They challenge it, but the old fear still lingers. Deep down, people still ask the same ancient questions. Why me? Why now? Why this pain? These are not scientific questions. They are theological ones. They come from a time when the Anunnaki ruled the universe with invisible ink, writing destinies into the bones of reality. And even now, as humanity grows more powerful, that ink has not completely faded. We still live in a world shaped by limits, aging, entropy, death. These are the last strongholds of the ancient gods. The ancient world did not truly disappear when the Anunnaki faded from memory. It simply changed its hiding place. It slipped out of stone temples and clay tablets and moved into something far more enduring, the human mind. The gods no longer needed statues or rituals because by then they had already succeeded in shaping how humanity understood reality itself. Even now, thousands of years later, people still feel that invisible pressure, the sense that life is not random, that events are not meaningless, that somewhere, somehow, things are being decided. That feeling did not come from nature. It came from the Anunnaki. In the deep cities of Sumer, long before the world knew the word destiny, people believed that every human life was written down before it was lived. The gods were not just watching the world, they were recording it. The priests described vast divine archives where the Anunnaki kept track of births, deaths, triumphs, and disasters. A person did not simply become successful, they were granted success. A person did not simply die, their time had been closed. This belief did something profound to the human spirit. It made people feel small. It made them feel temporary. It made them feel as if their lives belonged to something else, and this feeling has never left us. Even in a modern world filled with science and technology, people still say things like, "It was meant to be," or "That was my fate." These are not poetic phrases, they are echoes, remnants of a world where invisible gods decided who would be allowed to rise and who would quietly disappear. The Anunnaki did not need to rule humanity directly. They built a system where humans would rule themselves according to divine expectations. People learned to fear not just disaster, but divine disapproval. They learned to see suffering not as random misfortune, but as a sign that something had gone wrong in the cosmic order. And so humanity became cautious, not just in action, but in thought. The ancient priests taught that even dreams were messages, even accidents were signals. If something went wrong, it meant the gods were displeased, and when the gods were displeased, the only response was submission. This is how fate became a cage. The Anunnaki did not have to strike people down. People already believed they deserved whatever happened to them. They believed their pain had meaning, that their loss was justified, that their suffering was part of a grand design. This is far more powerful than any punishment. A flood destroys a city once, but belief controls generations. The Anunnaki understood this. By turning suffering into something sacred, they ensured that humanity would accept it instead of resisting it. The great irony is that the gods themselves did not see suffering as sacred, they saw it as useful. Pain kept humanity small, loss kept populations under control, death kept the world from becoming too crowded. These were not moral decisions, they were practical ones. But humans, desperate to make sense of their pain, turned those practical limits into spiritual truths. They said suffering was meaningful. They said suffering was deserved. They said suffering was part of a divine plan, and in doing so they became more obedient than the Anunnaki could have ever demanded. This is why the modern world still struggles with guilt, still struggles with shame, still struggles with the idea that failure makes someone unworthy. These are not biological instincts. They are ancient programming. The Anunnaki taught humanity that existence is conditional, that you must be useful, productive, obedient, or worthy in order to survive. And even now, people feel uncomfortable simply being alive without justification. Rest feels wrong, stillness feels lazy, peace feels undeserved. These are not natural emotions. They are the echo of a time when humans were created to work so gods could rest. But something strange has begun to happen. For the first time in history, humanity is beginning to notice the invisible bars of the cage. People are beginning to ask why suffering must exist, why aging must happen, why death must come. These questions would have terrified the Anunnaki because they reveal something dangerous, that the system the gods designed might not be permanent. The ancient world believed limits were sacred. The modern world is discovering they are optional. Every medical breakthrough, every technological leap, every attempt to extend life, these are acts of quiet rebellion against the old order, but rebellion always brings fear. Even now, people worry that curing disease is unnatural, that extending life is wrong, that changing the human condition is playing God. These fears do not come from science, they come from ancient memory. They come from a time when gods punished humans for becoming too numerous, too powerful, too loud. The Anunnaki did not want humanity to grow beyond control. And now humanity is doing exactly that, but the old world does not let go easily. It still whispers in moments of doubt. It still shapes how people see themselves. It still tells them that pain is inevitable. The idea that the gods might have been wrong would have been unthinkable in the ancient world. To even imagine such a thing would have felt like inviting disaster. In the age of the Anunnaki, gods did not represent opinions, they represented reality. To disagree with them was not rebellion, it was insanity. The sky would fall, the rivers would dry, the earth would crack open. That was how deeply their authority was woven into the human mind. And yet quietly, without anyone noticing the exact moment it began, humanity started to drift away from that absolute submission. It did not happen through violence. It did not happen through revolt. It happened through curiosity. People began to ask questions that would once have been forbidden. Why do the stars move the way they do? Why does disease spread? Why do floods happen? Why do some children die and others live? These were once answered with the names of gods. Now they were being answered with observation. And observation is dangerous to divine systems, because once you see patterns, you no longer need prayers. The Anunnaki's power had always depended on mystery. They ruled through the unknown. Humans feared what they could not predict, and so they surrendered control to beings who claimed to understand the universe. But as knowledge grew, the unknown began to shrink. The gods did not lose their power overnight. They lost it one explanation at a time. Rain was no longer a divine mood. It became weather. Illness was no longer a curse. It became infection. Death was no longer a judgment. It became biology. Each of these discoveries removed a small piece of divine authority. The Anunnaki did not disappear, but the world they had engineered began to look less like a sacred system and more like a mechanical one. And when a system looks mechanical, it can be changed. This realization terrified the old religions. It is why science was once treated as heresy, not because it was wrong, but because it was dangerous. If humans could understand how the world worked, they might stop believing that suffering was necessary. And that would undo everything the gods had built. The Anunnaki created a universe where pain kept humanity small. Science began to imagine a universe where pain could be reduced. That was not just progress, it was revolution. But even as humanity began to reshape its world, something deeper remained untouched. The physical limits could be challenged, disease could be treated, hunger could be eased, but the psychological inheritance of the Anunnaki was far harder to erase. People still felt watched, still felt judged, still felt unworthy. Even without gods, they carried the feeling that their lives were being evaluated by something unseen. This is the longest-lasting creation of the Anunnaki. They taught humanity to internalize divine authority, to become their own judges, to punish themselves with anxiety, guilt, and fear of failure. Even in a world without temples, people still live as if they are on trial. They feel they must justify their existence through work. They feel they must earn love. They feel they must deserve happiness. This is not natural. This is mythology turned inward. The Anunnaki no longer need to punish humans. Humans do it themselves, but something is changing. Slowly, quietly, a new idea is spreading through the world. The idea that suffering does not have to be meaningful, that pain does not have to be earned, that existence does not need permission. This idea would have been impossible in ancient Mesopotamia. It would have been seen as dangerous, arrogant, and blasphemous, but it is growing now. Long before humanity ever dared to question suffering, it learned to endure it. This endurance was not just a survival instinct, it was a spiritual inheritance. The ancient world had taught people that pain was woven into the structure of reality itself, that no matter where you ran or how high you climbed, the same invisible hand would always find you. That hand once belonged to the Anunnaki. Even after their names faded, the feeling remained. People did not simply fear pain, they expected it. They built their lives around the assumption that something would go wrong, that loss would come, that happiness was temporary. These beliefs were not pessimism, they were ancient wisdom passed down through generations shaped by divine limitation. But something subtle and profound began to change when humans started to live longer, when medicine pushed back death, when sanitation pushed back disease, when technology pushed back hunger. For the first time, large numbers of people experienced lives that were not defined by constant survival. And in that quiet space where suffering was reduced, a strange new question emerged. If pain can be avoided, why did it ever exist? This question cuts to the heart of the Anunnaki's design, because if suffering was necessary, it should be unavoidable. But it is. The more humanity learns, the more it realizes that many of the limits once believed to be divine are simply problems waiting to be solved. The Anunnaki had created a world where death kept humanity small, but science is slowly stretching that boundary. Each additional year of life is a small act of rebellion against ancient fate, and rebellion, even when quiet, always creates tension. There is a deep unease in the modern world about pushing too far. People worry about living too long. They worry about altering human nature. They worry about changing what it means to be alive. These worries are not scientific, they are theological. They are the voice of the old gods whispering that some doors should not be opened. The Anunnaki were not just gods of storms and fate. They were gods of limits. They believed the universe only worked if everything stayed within its assigned boundaries. Humans were given just enough intelligence to work, but not enough to escape. Just enough awareness to obey, but not enough to rebel. And yet here we are, learning, inventing, refusing to accept the world as it was given, but the old world is still inside us. People still feel that success is suspicious, that happiness must be temporary, that something bad is always waiting. This is the shadow of divine punishment, not as thunder from the sky, but as quiet anxiety in the heart. The fear of exceeding limits is older than civilization itself. It did not come from kings, laws, or empires. It came from the sky. From a time when humans believed that every step forward risked attracting the attention of gods who did not want them to rise too far. The Anunnaki were not jealous of humanity, but they were wary of it. To them, a world where humans grew too powerful was a world that might slip out of control, and control was everything. The ancient Mesopotamians believed the universe was a delicate system, constantly threatened by chaos. Storms, earthquakes, droughts, and floods were not just natural disasters. They were reminders that the balance could be broken at any moment. The Anunnaki existed to prevent that. They were not creators in the way later gods would be imagined. They were regulators. They kept the cosmic machine from tearing itself apart. Humanity was part of that machine, a loud part, a restless part. A part that kept multiplying. This is why limits were so important. Without limits, there would be too many mouths to feed, too many voices, too much disorder. And disorder was the enemy of the gods, not because it was evil, but because it was unpredictable. To the Anunnaki, unpredictability was terrifying. They governed a universe where everything was meant to follow a script. The tablets of destiny were not just records, they were instructions. When something deviated too far from what was written, the gods intervened. That intervention was what humans experienced as disaster. The flood was not about punishment. The plague was not about anger. The famine was not about sin. They were about correction. The Anunnaki were not asking who did wrong. They were asking what must be reduced. This way of thinking shaped human psychology for thousands of years. People learned to associate growth with danger, expansion with risk, change with divine attention. Even now, when something grows too fast, people instinctively expect it to collapse. This is not just economics, it is ancient fear. The Anunnaki taught humanity that rising too high invites a fall, and so humanity learned to fear its own potential. This fear was woven into myths across the world, stories of gods punishing those who dared to fly too close to the sun, stories of towers built too high and destroyed, stories of humans punished for seeking forbidden knowledge. These are not coincidences, they are echoes of a time when divine limits were real. But here is the quiet truth hidden inside those myths. The Anunnaki were not afraid of human ambition. They were afraid of losing control. A humanity that could outgrow disease, outlive death, and outthink fate would no longer need gods. And so the gods ensured that humanity would always be incomplete. They built weakness into the body. They built fear into the mind. They built decay into the world. These were not accidents. They were safeguards, and for thousands of years they worked. Civilizations rose and fell. Empires crumbled. Technologies were lost. Humanity never grew beyond a certain point. The world kept resetting itself again and again. But now something different is happening. For the first time, knowledge is not being lost between generations. For the first time, technology is not disappearing with the collapse of empires. For the first time, humanity is building on itself instead of starting over. This is unprecedented. The Anunnaki designed a world where progress would always be temporary. But humanity has begun to create continuity. And continuity is dangerous to systems built on reset. A species that remembers, that records, that preserves, that accumulates knowledge cannot be kept small forever. This is why the modern world feels so unstable. We are standing at the edge of a threshold that no ancient civilization ever reached. We are beginning to push against the final limits. Life expectancy, cognitive ability, biological vulnerability, all of these are being challenged, and with every challenge the ancient order weakens. But the psychological inheritance remains. People still fear going too far. They still fear breaking the natural order. They still fear that something terrible will happen if humanity becomes too powerful. These fears do not come from science. They come from the Anunnaki, from a time when exceeding your assigned place meant disaster. And as we move forward, we will explore how humanity's growing power is forcing it to confront the deepest question of all, not whether the gods exist, but whether the limits they left behind should still rule us. The limits the Anunnaki placed upon humanity were never just physical. They were psychological, emotional, and deeply spiritual. To understand how powerful those limits truly were, we must look not at ancient temples or lost cities, but at something far more fragile and far more revealing: the human mind. From the moment humans became self-aware, they began to notice something unsettling. They could imagine worlds better than the one they lived in. They could dream of peace, of endless life, of freedom from pain. And yet every time they reached for those dreams, reality pulled them back. Bodies grew old. Loved ones died. Civilizations crumbled. The Anunnaki had designed a universe that constantly reminded humans of their smallness. This did not just create suffering, it created humility. But humility, when forced, becomes fear. Ancient people did not simply accept death, they were taught to expect it, not in a peaceful way, but in a resigned one. Life was something to be endured, not something to be mastered. The gods were great, humans were temporary. This belief was so deeply ingrained that even joy felt suspicious. When things went too well, people waited for disaster. When peace lasted too long, they expected war. This was not pessimism, it was survival in a world ruled by divine limits. The Anunnaki had taught humanity that stability is temporary, and so humanity learned to brace itself. Even in love, people feared loss. Even in success, people feared collapse. The idea that something good could last forever felt unnatural. This emotional pattern is ancient. It is older than any religion still practiced today. It comes from a time when gods used destruction to maintain order, and yet something strange happened when humanity began to understand itself. Psychology, philosophy, and science slowly revealed that much of human suffering comes not from the world, but from the way we think about the world. Anxiety, guilt, shame, fear of failure, these are not imposed by nature. They are learned. And when people began to see that, the power of the old gods weakened, because the Anunnaki's greatest weapon was not flood or plague, it was belief. Belief that humans were small, belief that suffering was inevitable, belief that limits were sacred. Once those beliefs begin to crack, the entire system trembles. This is why modern humanity feels so torn. We live longer, safer lives than any generation before us, yet we are more anxious. We have more knowledge, yet more doubt. We have more freedom, yet more fear. Why? Because we are living between two worlds, one shaped by ancient gods who demanded limitation, and one being built by humans who no longer want it. And as we continue this journey, we will move deeper into that conflict, into the place where ancient divine design collides with modern human desire. A place where the future is no longer written on any tablet, divine or otherwise, only in human hands. The space between who humans were designed to be and who they are becoming is widening. It is not happening in explosions or revolutions, but in quiet moments, in hospitals where lives are saved that once would have ended, in laboratories where aging is studied like a disease instead of accepted like a law, and in the minds of people who no longer believe that suffering is sacred. This quiet shift would have terrified the Anunnaki, because it means the world they built is no longer unquestioned. The ancient gods did not want humanity to be comfortable. They wanted humanity to be manageable, and comfort makes people dangerous. A species that is not constantly fighting to survive has time to think, to plan, to imagine, and eventually to challenge the very structure of its reality. In the old world, most humans died young. They had no time to question why the world was the way it was. They were too busy trying to stay alive. But now, as lifespans stretch and suffering decreases, something unprecedented is happening. Humanity is thinking about itself, and self-awareness is always the first step toward rebellion. The Anunnaki gave humans just enough intelligence to work and worship, but not enough to break free. That balance held for thousands of years, but now that balance is shifting. The human mind is no longer satisfied with survival. It wants meaning, it wants purpose. It wants to know why it was made the way it was, and when a creation begins to question its creator, something fundamental has changed. For most of history, humans assumed that pain had a reason. That disease, disaster, and death were necessary parts of a divine plan, but modern science has shown that much of what once seemed sacred is simply mechanical. Cells age, DNA mutates, viruses spread, there is no moral force behind it. This realization is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it means suffering is not deserved. Terrifying because it means suffering has no higher meaning. The Anunnaki offered humanity a universe where pain was part of a story. Science offers a universe where pain is just a problem to be solved, and people are slowly choosing the second. But ancient belief systems do not disappear easily. They cling to culture, to language, to the way people think about themselves. Even now, people still talk about fate, destiny, and purpose as if these were real forces guiding their lives. These ideas come from the same place as the Anunnaki. They come from a time when humans could not imagine a world without divine oversight. But now that oversight is fading. Humanity is beginning to see itself not as a servant of cosmic forces, but as a participant in its own evolution. This is a dangerous thought. Because if we are not bound by divine limits, then we are responsible for everything that happens next. There is no one to blame, no one to beg, no one to forgive, only ourselves, and that responsibility is heavy. Perhaps that is why so many people still cling to the old idea that suffering must have meaning. It is easier to believe that pain is part of a divine plan than to accept that it might be unnecessary and therefore preventable. But as we continue this journey, we will explore what happens when humanity finally begins to accept that it may no longer be living in a world designed by gods, but in one it is slowly learning to design for itself. The old gods did not vanish in fire or thunder. They faded in silence. That is always how true power dies, not when it is challenged openly, but when it is quietly ignored. The Anunnaki ruled a world where humans looked upward for answers, but humanity is now learning to look inward, and that shift is more disruptive than any rebellion. In ancient times, every mystery belonged to the gods. Lightning was divine anger, disease was divine judgment, death was divine will. The Anunnaki stood behind every unknown, and humans lived in constant awareness that their lives were being observed, measured, and corrected. But the more humanity learns, the fewer shadows remain. Every shadow that disappears takes a god with it. The Anunnaki were creatures of the unknown. Their power thrived where explanation failed. When science began to explain the movement of stars, the spread of disease, and the mechanics of life itself, it did something revolutionary. It made the gods unnecessary, but something far more complex replaced them: responsibility. In a world ruled by gods, suffering could be blamed on divine will. In a world ruled by understanding, suffering becomes something we must confront ourselves. And that is far more frightening, because if no God sent the flood, then we must ask why floods happen. If no God sends disease, then we must ask why we allow disease to spread. If no God chooses who lives and dies, then we must ask why so many still suffer. The Anunnaki's greatest gift to humanity was also their greatest curse. They gave humans an excuse. An excuse not to take responsibility for the cruelty of the world, but now that excuse is fading, and humanity is being forced to face something terrifying. That much of the suffering in the world is not written in any divine tablet. It is created by us. This realization is painful. It shatters ancient comfort. It removes the idea that someone somewhere has a plan. It leaves us in a universe that does not promise justice, only possibility. Yet this is also where true freedom begins. The Anunnaki ruled through inevitability. Humans are beginning to rule through choice, but freedom comes with uncertainty. Without fate, there is no guarantee. Without destiny, there is no script. Without gods, there is no one to forgive or condemn us. This is the moment humanity has reached, a moment no ancient civilization ever imagined. When the Anunnaki designed humanity, they never imagined a future in which their creation would be able to look back and see the shape of the cage. They believed they had made the limits invisible, written so deeply into the fabric of life that no one would ever notice them. And for thousands of years they were right. Humans did not question mortality. They did not question suffering. They did not question why joy was so fragile and loss so constant. They accepted it because it felt like reality itself. But now something extraordinary has happened. Humanity has begun to see that what it once called reality may have been architecture, an ancient system of control left behind by gods who no longer walk the world. And the moment a cage is seen, it is already beginning to break. In the old world, humans lived short lives filled with hardship. Most never traveled far from where they were born. Most never learned to read. Most never had the time or safety to wonder why things were the way they were. Survival consumed them. And this was exactly what the Anunnaki needed. A struggling species does not rebel, but the modern world is different. For the first time, millions of humans live long enough to reflect. They have the space to ask questions that would once have been impossible. Why do we age? Why do we die? Why do we feel so much fear even when we are safe? Why does happiness feel temporary? These are not scientific questions. They are the first cracks in a divine system. The Anunnaki taught humanity that limits were sacred, that weakness was natural, that fragility was necessary. But now humanity is beginning to treat limits as problems, not truths. Disease is being challenged, aging is being studied, even death is being questioned, and this terrifies the ancient order, not because the gods are watching, but because the structure they built is unraveling. There is a strange tension in the modern world. We are surrounded by comfort, yet haunted by anxiety. We live longer than any generation before us, yet fear loss more than ever. We have more control over our environment, yet feel more powerless inside. This is the psychological aftermath of a broken divine system. The Anunnaki left behind a world where suffering was normal. Humans are now living in a world where suffering is optional, and the mind does not know how to handle that. For thousands of years, pain was the rhythm of life. Loss was expected. Death was common. People did not plan for a distant future because few ever reached one. But now people live long enough to build dreams that stretch decades ahead. And when those dreams are threatened, the fear is overwhelming. This fear is not weakness. It is the collision of two worlds. One world shaped by ancient gods who expected humans to be temporary, and one world shaped by humans who are no longer willing to be. Every time medicine saves a life, it violates the old design. Every time technology prevents a disaster, it defies the ancient order. Every time someone refuses to accept suffering as normal, they are quietly breaking a rule written thousands of years ago. But ancient systems do not collapse without resistance. The idea that suffering is meaningful still holds power. Many people believe that pain builds character, that struggle is necessary, that hardship gives life depth. These beliefs sound noble, but they are echoes of a time when suffering was unavoidable. They are the last defense of a world designed by gods, a world where humans were never meant to be safe. Yet something inside humanity is waking up, a deep, quiet realization that the universe does not have to be cruel, that fragility is not sacred, that pain is not proof of purpose. This realization is not loud, it does not arrive in revolutions. It arrives in small moments, in a doctor saving a life that once would have been lost, in a scientist pushing back the boundaries of aging, in a person refusing to accept despair as normal. These moments may seem small, but they are dangerous to ancient gods because they prove that the system is not eternal. The world the Anunnaki left behind was not a ruin, it was a machine. A vast, silent system of rules, limits, and invisible boundaries that continued to operate long after the gods themselves had vanished from memory. Humans were born into it without knowing its origin, without knowing that its architecture had ever been designed by anyone at all. To them it was simply reality. They did not see the cage because it had no bars. It was made of time, of aging, of hunger, of fear, of loss. And above all, it was made of the quiet expectation that everything must end. This expectation shaped every human culture that ever existed. Even in the most joyful civilizations, there was always a shadow behind the laughter. People loved knowing that love could be taken away. They built knowing that their buildings would someday fall. They raised children knowing they might not live to see them grow old. This was not pessimism. It was ancient conditioning. The Anunnaki had taught humanity that permanence was dangerous. If nothing lasted, nothing could grow too powerful. This is why death was built into the human body like a hidden clock. This is why cells wear down. This is why memory fades. This is why even the strongest things eventually crumble. These are not just biological facts, they are remnants of divine policy. But for the first time since humanity was created, that policy is being challenged not by gods, but by humans themselves. Modern medicine does not treat death as sacred. Modern science does not treat aging as inevitable. Modern technology does not treat limitation as holy. It treats them as problems. And that single shift from acceptance to investigation is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to the Anunnaki's design. When humans were created, they were not meant to ask why their bodies failed. They were meant to endure it. When people grew sick, they prayed. When they grew old, they accepted it. When they died, it was seen as natural, even necessary. But now humanity has begun to see these things differently. Illness is not fate, it is a malfunction. Aging is not destiny, it is a process. Death is not divine, it is a breakdown. And anything that breaks can be repaired. This idea alone is enough to shake a god. The Anunnaki ruled by convincing humanity that the world was exactly as it was meant to be. That suffering had purpose. That loss had meaning. That limitation was wisdom. But what happens when a species realizes that the world might simply be unfinished, not broken, unfinished? This is the quiet revolution unfolding across the modern age. Humans are no longer content to live inside the blueprint they were given. They are editing it, improving it, slowly rewriting the conditions of existence itself. This is why the future feels so strange, so uncertain, so full of both hope and dread. We're standing in a world where ancient limits still operate but no longer command absolute obedience. People still age but not as quickly. People still die but not as often. People still suffer but not as blindly. The Anunnaki's system is weakening, and systems do not weaken without creating instability. This is why the modern world feels emotionally fragile. The old certainties are gone, but the new ones are not yet solid. We no longer believe suffering is divine, but we have not yet learned how to live without it. We no longer trust fate, but we have not yet learned how to carry full responsibility for our own existence. We are in between a universe designed by gods and a universe being built by humans. The old world told us who we were. The new world asks us to decide, and that is terrifying. Because if no divine plan exists, then every life is precious not because it was chosen, but because it is fragile. If no fate guides us, then every moment matters not because it is written, but because it is fleeting. This is a different kind of meaning, a meaning not imposed from above, but created from within. The Anunnaki would not recognize this world. They designed a humanity that obeyed, a humanity that endured, a humanity that accepted its limits. What they are witnessing now, through the echo of their own design, is a humanity that is beginning to refuse, not loudly, not violently, but steadily, with every cure, with every invention, with every life saved that once would have been lost. The machine they built is still running, but its gears are slowly being replaced, and we are not even close to seeing what will happen when it finally stops. There is a strange stillness at the center of the modern world, a stillness that did not exist when the Anunnaki ruled. In the ancient age, humanity lived inside a storm of divine uncertainty. Every season could bring famine, every illness could be a death sentence, every earthquake, flood, or eclipse could mean the gods were angry. People existed in a constant state of alert, scanning the world for signs that their fragile place in the cosmic order was about to be taken away. But today the storm has quieted, not completely, not safely, but enough that people can hear something else beneath it, the sound of their own thoughts, and that is what changes everything. The Anunnaki never feared human bodies, they feared human minds. They feared what would happen if humans ever had the time, safety, and mental space to think deeply about their own condition. A species that is always hungry, always tired, always afraid does not ask dangerous questions. It survives. A species that becomes comfortable begins to wonder. Why do we age? Why do we die? Why does suffering exist at all? These questions would have been meaningless in ancient Sumer. They would have been answered with the names of gods. But now, in a world where those names no longer carry weight, the questions remain unanswered, hanging in the air like an open door. And open doors are terrifying to old systems. The Anunnaki created humanity to fit inside a narrow window of existence, long enough to work, short enough to be replaced, smart enough to obey, weak enough to never rebel. For thousands of years that design held. Civilizations came and went. Kings rose and fell. The gods watched from their quiet distance as humanity remained exactly what it was meant to be, temporary. But something has gone wrong with the design, not suddenly, not violently, but gradually as small improvements stacked on top of one another. Antibiotics, vaccines, electricity, computers. Each of these was a small crack in the ancient architecture, a tiny refusal to accept that suffering was necessary, a quiet insistence that the world could be made gentler. The Anunnaki had never planned for gentleness. Their universe was built on pressure. Pressure keeps systems stable. Pressure keeps populations controlled. Pressure keeps change slow. But pressure is now leaking out of the world. People are living longer. Children are dying less. Knowledge is spreading faster than ever before. And with that knowledge comes a dangerous realization. The limits of human existence are not laws, they are designs, and designs can be redesigned. This is the moment humanity has reached, not a dramatic apocalypse, not a divine judgment, but a quiet, irreversible awakening. A realization that the world we inherited was not built for our happiness, it was built for our obedience. And as this awareness spreads, the old divine machinery begins to shake, not because gods are angry, but because they are no longer needed. The machine the Anunnaki built was never meant to be noticed. That was its greatest strength. Humans did not see it because they were born inside it. They grew up inside its walls. They lived and died without ever realizing that the shape of their existence had been carefully designed long before their first ancestor ever drew breath. But once a system becomes visible, it becomes fragile. The Anunnaki had woven limitation into everything, into the way bodies age, into the way memory fades, into the way fear keeps people from reaching too far, dreaming too big, or living too freely. Even joy was designed to be temporary. Even love was designed to be vulnerable to loss. Nothing in the human experience was meant to be stable. Stability creates independence, and independence is dangerous to gods. The ancient myths were filled with warnings about those who tried to escape their place. Kings who became too powerful, heroes who defied the gods, mortals who sought immortality. In every story they were punished, not because they were evil, but because they were becoming uncontrollable. These myths were not moral lessons, they were instructions. Do not go too far, do not ask too much, do not try to be more than you were made to be. And for thousands of years, humanity listened. But the modern world no longer speaks the language of myth. It speaks the language of data, evidence, and possibility. And those languages do not care about divine boundaries. When scientists map the genome, they are not thinking about fate. When doctors extend life, they are not thinking about destiny. When engineers build machines that can think, they are not thinking about the will of the gods. They are thinking about what can be done, and what can be done is slowly replacing what was once forbidden. This is why the future feels both hopeful and terrifying. We are moving into territory that was once guarded by divine fear. We are rewriting the rules that governed humanity for tens of thousands of years, but there is a deep conflict inside us. We want to be free, but we are afraid of what freedom means. Because if the Anunnaki were wrong, then suffering was never sacred. If fate was an illusion, then failure was never deserved. If the world has no divine script, then every injustice becomes something we must answer for ourselves. This is a heavy burden. It is much easier to believe that pain is meaningful than to accept that it is optional. It is much easier to believe that some people are meant to suffer than to admit that we have allowed them to. This is why the old gods still live inside us, not as beings but as beliefs. Beliefs that say some lives matter less, beliefs that say struggle is noble, beliefs that say pain is character. These beliefs are the last stronghold of the Anunnaki's world. And as we move deeper into this story, we will explore how humanity is slowly, painfully beginning to let go of them, even as the weight of responsibility grows heavier than any divine command ever was. There's a quiet moment that arrives in every civilization, a moment so subtle that most people never notice it happening. It is the moment when fear begins to lose its grip, when obedience weakens, and when the stories that once kept a society in line start to feel less convincing. For ancient humanity, that moment took thousands of years to arrive, but when it did, it was irreversible. The Anunnaki had ruled through awe, through mystery, through the weight of the unknown. Humans did not need proof that the gods existed. They felt their presence in every storm, every disease, every sudden death. The world itself seemed to be alive with divine intention. To disobey felt like madness. To question felt like suicide. But as humanity learned how the world actually worked, something changed in the deepest part of the human psyche. The universe began to look less like a kingdom and more like a system. And systems can be understood. A storm is not anger. A virus is not judgment. An earthquake is not punishment. They are processes. And once something becomes a process, it stops being sacred. This was the beginning of the end for the Anunnaki's invisible empire, but there is a strange irony here. Even as humans learned that the gods were not causing disasters, they did not become more at peace. They became more afraid, because if no god controls the world, then no one does. This realization creates a different kind of terror. A world without divine oversight is a world where suffering can happen for no reason at all, where children can die without having done anything wrong, where entire cities can be erased by accidents of nature. For ancient people, at least there was meaning in tragedy. At least it was part of a plan, but now humanity was beginning to confront something colder, a universe that does not care. This is the deepest challenge to the Anunnaki's legacy, not the denial of gods, but the denial of meaning, and this is where the story becomes truly unsettling. Because when people lose the belief that suffering is sacred, they begin to ask dangerous questions. Why do we let people starve? Why do we accept war? Why do we allow disease to spread? If no God demands these things, then they are not inevitable. They are choices. This is where human freedom becomes terrifying. It is one thing to live under divine rule. It is another to realize you are responsible for the world you live in. The Anunnaki's system made people small. Freedom makes them accountable. And as this realization spreads, the ancient architecture of fate begins to collapse. Not in fire, not in thunder, but in quiet moments of moral clarity. Moments when people refuse to accept suffering as normal. Moments when they refuse to believe that some lives matter less. Moments when they say, this does not have to be this way. Those moments are far more dangerous to old gods than any rebellion ever was. When a civilization begins to move from fate to choice, it does not do so smoothly. It hesitates, it stumbles, it looks backward even as it walks forward. Humanity, raised under the long shadow of the Anunnaki, is no different. For thousands of years, people lived in a world where suffering had an explanation. Even when that explanation was cruel, it was comforting. It meant someone was in charge. But now, in a world increasingly shaped by human decisions rather than divine commands, that comfort is disappearing. And in its place comes something far more frightening: responsibility. To be responsible means there is no one else to blame, no invisible force to accuse, no divine plan to hide behind. If people starve, it is because we let them. If wars rage, it is because we choose them. If the planet is destroyed, it is because we failed to protect it. This is the weight of freedom. The Anunnaki never wanted humanity to feel this weight. A species burdened with full responsibility might try to reshape the world, and a reshaped world would not need gods. This is why the ancient gods always presented themselves as guardians of order. They claimed that without them, everything would fall into chaos. But what they truly feared was not chaos, it was independence. An independent humanity would no longer accept the limits placed upon it. It would no longer see aging as natural, death as necessary, or suffering as sacred. It would treat them as enemies to be defeated, and this is already happening. People do not pray for cures anymore, they research them. People do not accept famine as divine punishment, they build systems to prevent it. People do not see disaster as fate. They see it as something to prepare for and reduce. Each of these is a small but profound act of rebellion against a world designed by gods, and yet the fear remains. Even now, many people feel that pushing too far is dangerous, that humanity is playing God, that there are lines that should not be crossed. These fears come from ancient memory. They come from a time when crossing lines meant attracting divine wrath, but those gods are gone. Only the lines remain. For as long as humanity has existed, it has lived inside a story written by something older than memory. Long before the first cities rose, before the first kings ruled, before the first words were carved into clay, the Anunnaki shaped the world that humans would inherit. They did not merely create bodies, they created boundaries. They decided how long a human could live, how much pain a body could endure, how fragile joy would be, and how quickly everything would fade. And then they stepped away. But the world they left behind continued to run exactly as they had designed it. Aging continued, disease continued, loss continued, death continued, and humanity assumed this was simply the nature of existence. But now, at the edge of a new era, something extraordinary has happened. Humanity has begun to realize that what it once called nature might have been design, that what it once called fate might have been architecture. That what it once called the way things are might have been nothing more than an ancient system of control. The Anunnaki believed suffering kept humanity small. They believed fragility kept humanity obedient. They believed impermanence kept humanity manageable. And for thousands of years they were right, but something they never predicted has finally occurred. Humanity has begun to see the pattern. We have learned how bodies break down. We have learned how diseases spread. We have learned how memory fades and cells age, and once something is understood, it can be changed. This is the quiet revolution unfolding across the modern world. Not a war against gods, but a slow dismantling of the limits they left behind. Every cure, every invention, every life saved that once would have been lost is a small act of defiance against a universe that was designed to be cruel. The Anunnaki ruled through inevitability. Humanity is learning to rule through choice. And that changes everything. For the first time in history, the future is not written on any tablet, not in heaven, not in destiny, not in the will of ancient gods. It is being written by human hands, human minds, and human hearts. We are no longer merely surviving inside a world we were given. We are beginning to build a world of our own. And that is the most powerful and most terrifying moment in human history. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden history of the Anunnaki and the deep forces that shaped humanity, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think, and let us know where in the world you're watching from.